They thought he was just another black man they could intimidate on the street. What they didn't know was that the man they blocked in broad daylight wasn't just anybody. He was the mayor of the city. And in the next few moments, the power tables would flip in a way they never saw coming. Brian, a tall, composed black man in his early 40s, had just stepped outside with a coffee in hand. But the sight stopped him cold. 2 police cruisers were parked across his driveway, blocking his car entirely. What happened next was the kind of confrontation that makes you hold your breath. The officers didn't just block him. They challenged him, questioned him, and treated him like he didn't belong in his own home. And yet, what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the man they were trying to humiliate wasn't just another black man in the wrong neighborhood. He was their city's mayor. By the time this story ends, you'll see how tables turned so fast. Even the officers didn't know what hit them. You'll also see how everyday assumptions about race, about power, about dignity, can lead to one of the most humiliating lessons of someone's career. And if this is your first time on our channel, make sure you hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because we bring you real stories just like this one. Stories of injustice, power shifts, and shocking turnarounds you'll never forget. Brian Carter was not the kind of mayor you usually read about in newspapers. He didn't live in a gated mansion with private security or chauffeur-driven cars. No, Brian still lived in the same middle-class neighborhood where he grew up. He waved at the mailman, helped neighbors bring groceries in, and was often spotted mowing his own lawn on Saturday mornings. To most of the city, Brian was more than just a politician, he was a symbol. He had been elected 3 years earlier after running a grassroots campaign that promised to bring fairness and accountability back to local government. He won by connecting with everyday people, not by standing above them. And yet, despite his title, Brian never carried himself like someone untouchable. He still walked his dog every evening. He still bought his morning coffee from the small cafe down the street, where the barista knew his order by heart. And he still drove himself around in the same silver sedan he'd owned for almost a decade. That's what made this moment so striking. Here was a man who represented the entire city, a man who had the authority to oversee the very police department now sitting in his driveway. And yet, on this sunny afternoon, all of that seemed invisible. The neighbors knew who he was. The shop owners knew. The children who waved at him as he drove past knew. But to those 2 officers leaning against their cruiser, arms folded, eyes narrowed, he was just another black man they thought didn't belong. This wasn't the first time Brian had faced subtle forms of disrespect. Even as mayor, he had felt the sting of being overlooked, underestimated, or questioned. But never before had it been so blatant, so public, and so humiliating. And here's where the audience starts asking themselves, what would I do if I were in Brian's shoes? Would I lash out? Would I prove who I am? Or would I let silence do the talking? Brian took a sip of his coffee, steadied himself, and prepared to address the situation. What he said next, and how he handled this confrontation, would not only stun the officers but also leave the entire department scrambling in the aftermath. Long before he became mayor, Brian Carter was just another kid running down the cracked sidewalks of Eastwood, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. His mother, Lorraine, worked double shifts as a nurse, while his father, Daniel, was a city bus driver. They didn't have much, but they had pride in hard work, in education, and in standing up for what was right. From an early age, Brian had seen both the good and the bad in his city. He remembered riding the bus with his father and watching him greet every passenger with a smile, no matter how tired he was. He remembered his mother coming home at dawn, still in scrubs, reminding him to make something of yourself so you won't have to struggle like this. But he also remembered the other side. The times police cars cruised slowly through his neighborhood, pulling kids off the corner for no reason, questioning young men on their way home from school, and treating them as suspects before citizens. One of those young men had been Brian himself, stopped at just 16 years old while walking home with a backpack full of textbooks. That moment left a mark. He wasn't arrested, wasn't charged, but the humiliation burned. He vowed then that if he ever got into a position of influence, he would use it to make sure no one else had to feel powerless the way he did that night. Brian studied hard, earned scholarships, and eventually went to law school. He came back home not to chase money but to fight for fairness. As a lawyer, he took on cases of ordinary people. Workers unfairly fired, tenants bullied by landlords, small business owners hit with unjust fines. His reputation grew. People saw him as a fighter, but a calm one, a man who used facts and dignity instead of anger. By the time he announced his candidacy for mayor, many doubted he could win. He wasn't backed by the wealthy elite. He wasn't polished in the way career politicians were. But he had something better: trust. People believed him when he spoke because he wasn't talking at them. He was talking with them. When he won, it was a victory that symbolized something much bigger than just politics. For his neighborhood, for his community, it was proof that someone who looked like them, someone who had lived their struggles, could sit at the very top of City Hall. And yet, here he was on a sunny afternoon holding a file in front of his own driveway, treated like he didn't belong. This was more than just an inconvenience. This wasn't just a car blocking his driveway. This was history repeating itself, a reminder that no matter how far he had climbed, prejudice still lurked in plain sight. The audience now understands the stakes. This wasn't about a parking issue. It was about dignity. It was about respect. It was about a mayor facing the very injustice he had built his career fighting against. And just as Brian was about to step forward and speak, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors peeking out their doors, a delivery driver pausing across the street, and even a group of kids stopping their basketball game to see what was happening. The stage was set. The driveway had become a stage, the city's mayor about to play his most unexpected role yet. Not in council chambers, but in broad daylight, in front of everyone. The sun was still high, casting sharp shadows on the quiet suburban street when Brian pulled into his driveway. He had just finished a morning packed with city council meetings, policy reviews, and phone calls about infrastructure updates. His mind buzzed with thoughts of budgets, schools, and the dozens of people he had spoken to that day. But for a brief moment, he looked forward to stepping inside his home, greeting his wife, and enjoying a peaceful lunch before diving back into work. But then he saw them. Two squad cars sat angled across his driveway like barricades. Their lights weren't flashing, but the sight was jarring. It wasn't just the inconvenience of being blocked, it was the implication. Two uniformed officers leaned casually against the hood of one car, chatting with each other, clearly unaware of whose driveway they were blocking. Brian slowed his car to a stop in the street, honked lightly, and rolled down his window. "Excuse me, officers," he called out, keeping his tone even. "You're blocking my driveway." The officers exchanged a quick glance. One of them, a tall, broad man with sunglasses that hid his eyes, stepped forward. "Sir, you'll need to keep driving. We're handling something here." Brian's brows lifted. "Handling something? In my driveway?" The second officer scoffed under his breath, muttering just loud enough, "Yeah, sure, your driveway." Brian inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had been in public service long enough to know when pride and temper could turn a simple moment into an explosive one. Still, there was something bitter in the way the officer dismissed him, like his words carried no weight, no matter how calmly spoken. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Brian said, carefully choosing his words. "But this is my property. If you could just move the vehicles, I can get inside." The officer with the sunglasses tilted his head, studying Brian like he was trying to size him up. "License and ID," he finally demanded. Brian blinked. "For what?" "Because I said so," the officer shot back, his tone carrying that sharp edge of authority that dared you to push back. Inside, Brian's pulse began to quicken. He had dealt with heated council meetings, angry citizens, and aggressive reporters, but standing in broad daylight, on the street where he lived, being treated like he didn't belong in his own home, this hit differently. He could feel the heat creeping up the back of his neck, the tension building in his jaw. But he also knew eyes were watching. A neighbor across the street had stepped onto their porch, clearly interested in the scene. Another person walking their dog slowed to a near stop. Brian faced a choice: reveal who he was immediately, or hold back and let this moment expose itself fully? He decided on the latter. "Officers," Brian said evenly, "I've given you no reason to suspect me of anything. All I've asked is for you to move so I can access my driveway. Do you usually ask homeowners for their ID before letting them into their own property?" The officer smirked. "Homeowners?" He leaned slightly toward Brian's car. "That's funny. You don't look like the type to live here." That sentence hit the air like a slap. Brian's fingers tightened around his steering wheel. His heartbeat was loud in his ears now, but he forced himself not to flinch, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing frustration. Instead, he stepped out of his car, calm, collected, tall. "I think," Brian said in a low but firm voice, "you'll want to reconsider how you're handling this situation." The taller officer crossed his arms. "And why's that?" Brian held his gaze, his silence deliberate. The kind of silence that carried power, waiting for the right moment to shatter it. That moment was coming, and neither of the officers had the faintest idea who they were really speaking to. The air felt heavy now, charged with tension that wasn't visible but thick enough to sense. Neighbors were no longer just peeking, they were openly watching. A man down the street stopped mowing his lawn, leaning against his fence with folded arms. A young woman across the road lifted her phone, recording quietly. Brian stood tall beside his car, his shadow stretching across the pavement. For years, he had been the composed mayor of the city, the one who solved conflicts, not the one caught in them. But this moment was different. The taller officer, still wearing those reflective sunglasses, stepped closer, as if trying to intimidate Brian. "Sir, I'll say this one more time. Either you show me some ID, or we'll have to consider this an obstruction." Brian tilted his head slightly, his calmness almost unnerving. "Obstruction? For standing in front of my own home?" His voice wasn't raised, it didn't need to be. The weight of his words alone carried authority. The second officer, a bit younger and clearly more uneasy now, shifted his stance. His eyes darted toward the small crowd forming nearby, then back at Brian. He whispered something to his partner, but the tall one waved him off, refusing to back down. Brian finally sighed, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his wallet. Slowly, deliberately, he held up his mayoral ID card, an official document stamped with the city seal and his full name, Brian Carter, Mayor. The silence that followed was deafening. The officer's smirk faltered. Behind those sunglasses, his eyes widened, though his mouth stayed shut. The younger officer took a sharp breath, muttering under his breath, "No way!" Brian didn't drop his gaze. He didn't gloat, didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I asked you politely. I asked you respectfully. And instead of listening, you judged me before you knew who I was." The crowd murmured. The woman recording zoomed in, capturing every second. The tall officer finally removed his sunglasses, as if seeing Brian clearly for the first time. His mouth opened, then closed, words fumbling at the edge of his lips. "Mr. Mayor, we didn't realize." Brian cut him off, calm but firm. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't realize. You assumed." The weight of those words landed like a gavel striking in court. Everyone felt it. The younger officer looked down, ashamed, while the older one stood frozen, his authority suddenly stripped away. Brian pocketed his ID, straightened his jacket, and gestured toward the squad cars blocking his driveway. "Now, are you going to move these vehicles? Or should I call the chief myself?" The officers scrambled. Engines roared to life, tires shifted against the pavement, and within seconds, the driveway was clear. But the damage had been done, not to Brian, but to their reputations. The entire neighborhood had witnessed their arrogance crumble in broad daylight. As Brian walked back to his car, he glanced at the gathering crowd. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered in disbelief, and one elderly neighbor simply said out loud what everyone else was thinking. They just messed with the wrong man. The moment Brian stepped into his driveway, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as an ordinary day was now a scene etched into everyone's memory. The police cruisers pulled away in silence, their flashing lights extinguished as if ashamed of what had just happened. But the neighborhood was buzzing. People who rarely spoke to one another were now gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing, replaying the moment over and over in their minds. The woman who had recorded the entire confrontation lowered her phone slowly, as though she had just captured history. "Is it real?" one man muttered, shaking his head. "Did that officer just try to push around the mayor of the city? In broad daylight?" "Oh, it's real," another neighbor replied, "and the whole world's about to see it." Brian remained calm. Even his eyes followed him. He wasn't a man who chased spectacle, but he knew this moment was bigger than himself. He had been targeted for nothing more than how he looked in his own driveway, and now the truth was on full display. Inside his home, his phone began to vibrate with incoming messages. Colleagues, friends, even members of the city council. Word had already begun to spread. By evening, the video was circulating online, shared across platforms with captions that told the story in blunt terms. Police try to intimidate a man in his driveway until they realize he's the mayor. The comments flooded in: outrage, disbelief, support. Some praised Brian's calm composure. Others were furious at how quickly the officers had assumed the worst. But one thing was certain: nobody was ignoring it. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, the fallout was immediate. The younger officer sat with his head in his hands, already regretting the choices that had led to that driveway standoff. The older one paced back and forth, his jaw tight, knowing that his arrogance had now become public humiliation. Their superior officers weren't pleased. "Do you realize what you've done?" one captain barked. "You just embarrassed this entire department in front of the city." Back at City Hall, Brian's staff was already strategizing. Should the mayor issue a statement? Should he let the video speak for itself? Brian, however, had other plans. That evening, he stepped outside again. The sun was setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, and neighbors were still outside, waiting, watching. Brian addressed them not as a politician, but as one of their own. "I want you all to understand something," he began. His voice was steady, carrying across the street. "Today wasn't about me being mayor. Today was about what happens when people are judged before they're even given a chance to speak. If this can happen to me, standing in front of my own home, it can happen to anyone." Heads nodded. Some clapped softly. Others wiped away tears. The gravity of his words sank deep. Then, almost as if on cue, a little boy spoke up from the crowd. "But you showed them, right?" His innocence made everyone smile. Brian chuckled softly. "I didn't show them, son. The truth did." The crowd erupted into applause. Not thunderous, but genuine, heartfelt. And from that day forward, the incident was more than just a viral video. It became a story, a reminder, a lesson that spread not only through the city but across the nation. The two officers would face internal review, their actions scrutinized under a harsh light. The younger one would eventually admit fault, but the older one would never fully recover from the disgrace. Brian, on the other hand, walked away stronger, not because of his title, but because he had stood tall in the face of prejudice and let dignity, not anger, speak louder than anything else. And as the video racked up millions of views, one line from the neighborhood that day kept echoing through the comments, shared like a mantra: "They just messed with the wrong man." By the next morning, Brian's world had shifted. What had begun as a frustrating, humiliating confrontation in his own driveway had turned into a nationwide conversation. The video had spread beyond the city, beyond the state, picked up by news outlets, morning talk shows, and podcasts. Everywhere you looked, the headline was the same: "Police block black man's driveway. Turns out, he's the mayor." The irony was too sharp, too striking to ignore. The clip played on repeat. The officers approaching Brian, their tone sharp and dismissive, their posture aggressive. Then came the moment when Brian calmly revealed who he was, the silence that followed, and the officers' faltering retreat. Millions replayed that silence, again and again, as if searching for its meaning. Reporters camped outside City Hall. Emails and calls poured in. Some messages carried outrage, some carried solidarity, and others carried stories. Personal stories from people who had faced similar treatment but without the shield of public office to protect them. Brian sat at his desk, scrolling through his inbox. He saw names he didn't recognize. College students, single mothers, retired veterans, all telling him, "Your story is my story too." That hit him the hardest. Because deep down, Brian knew this wasn't about him being mayor. It was about the countless times this story had unfolded without cameras, without witnesses, without justice. Meanwhile, the city buzzed. Coffee shops, offices, and schoolyards hummed with the same conversation. People who had never cared about local politics suddenly knew their mayor by name, not just as a politician, but as a man who had lived what so many had endured. But the police department, they weren't celebrating. Inside those walls, tension rose like a storm. The chief held a press conference, trying to smooth things over, calling it a misunderstanding. The words fell flat. No one was buying it. The video was too clear, too raw. The younger officer released a public apology, shaky but sincere. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. I was wrong. It was uncomfortable, but at least it was something." The older officer, however, refused to bend. He blamed media bias and selective editing. His defiance only deepened the public's anger. And then came the late-night shows. Comedians turned the incident into a punchline, mocking the officers' stunned faces when they realized who they were dealing with. Audiences laughed, but underneath the humor was a sharp edge of truth. Brian didn't laugh. He didn't need to. His focus was elsewhere. One evening, he stood in his living room, watching the clip play yet again on a news channel. His wife, Angela, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know what this means, right?" she said softly. He nodded. "It means we've still got a long way to go." Angela squeezed his hand. "But maybe this time people will actually listen." The next day, Brian addressed the public in an official capacity. Cameras clicked, microphones stretched forward. He didn't speak like a man seeking pity or revenge. He spoke like a leader. "What happened to me was not unique," he said firmly. "It happens every day to people who don't have cameras around, who don't have a title to protect them. This isn't about me. This is about fairness. This is about respect. This is about justice that doesn't change depending on who you are or what position you hold." The room fell silent. His words weren't just sound bites. They were a challenge. By the time he finished, the applause was thunderous. Not just from the room, but from living rooms, office screens, and phones across the country. His story had become more than a viral clip. It had become a rallying cry. And as the sun set that night, Brian stood once more in his driveway, the same spot where it all began. Neighbors waved. Some stopped to thank him. Others just looked at him differently now. Not as the mayor, but as a man who had turned humiliation into a moment of truth. The tables had turned, yes. But Brian knew this was just the beginning of something far bigger than himself. Brian knew that speeches and viral clips weren't enough. Words could ignite a fire, but without action, flames faded into smoke. If this moment was to mean anything, it had to spark change, real, lasting change. So, a week after the incident, he called a special council meeting at City Hall. The chamber was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Community members filled the seats, some wearing shirts that read, "Respect starts here." Brian took his seat at the front, his expression calm but resolute. He wasn't there to relive his own humiliation. He was there to set a precedent. "The events of last week," he began, "showed us something we can't ignore. They showed us the gap between what we say we value and how those values are applied. That stops today." He laid out a plan. Sweeping reforms for the city's police department, mandatory training in de-escalation and bias recognition, a civilian oversight board with real authority, body cameras that couldn't be conveniently turned off, and, most critically, a system of accountability that didn't protect officers just because of their badges. The room buzzed. Some council members shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. But Brian wasn't done. "This isn't about punishing two men," he said. "It's about protecting everyone else." It's about ensuring that what happened in my driveway doesn't happen in yours." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The council voted. For once, politics didn't cloud the outcome. The reforms passed. The city was on its way to becoming a model for accountability. That night, back at home, Brian stood again in his driveway. The same stretch of concrete where he had once felt dismissed now felt different. It wasn't just a driveway anymore. It was a reminder of how quickly things could shift, how fragile dignity could feel, and how powerful it became when defended. Angela walked out, leaning against the doorframe. "You really turned it around," she said with a smile. Brian shook his head softly. "We turned it around. The people demanded it. I just happened to be standing in the driveway that day. And that was the truth. This wasn't just his story. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated." The viral clip would eventually fade from the headlines, replaced by the next scandal, the next news cycle. But the change it sparked, the policies, the conversations, the accountability would remain. Brian hadn't just turned the tables in that driveway. He had flipped the script for the whole city. And somewhere deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a much bigger fight. Don't let this story stop here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because the real victory wasn't proving who he was. The real victory was proving what could happen when justice finally had a witness.